You're dead weight." Those words came from my son's mouth, cold, cruel, and as if that weren't enough, he tilted his head and spat on the floor, right next to my chair. In that instant, the family dinner ended without warning. The laughter died. Forks froze in midair. The overly bright dining room suddenly felt heavy, as if every light bulb wanted to highlight my shame. Everyone looked at me, some in shock, others pretending not to, but all of them waiting. Before I go on, let me ask you something. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and hit subscribe. Because every comment and every subscription isn't just a number. It's proof that respect inside a family isn't a luxury, it's a right. And together, we show the world that dignity isn't begged for, it's earned. Back to the scene. My son, Matthew, was still holding up his wine glass. The red liquid swirled under the light, gleaming like blood. The smirk on his lips cut deeper than any slap to the face. He wasn't just spitting on the floor. He was spitting on me, on my story, on my life. My hands trembled. The fork I held clattered against the plate, making a metallic noise that echoed in the silence. My wife, Victoria, raised her hand to her mouth, trying to hide her horror. A cousin looked away, fiddling nervously with his napkin, as if that could make him invisible. An aunt cleared her throat, uneasy, but no one said a word. No one dared. And me? I sat there, swallowing the shame like poison. My chest burned, my face burned, and the only thought in my head was, my own son, the one I worked 40 years for, the boy I taught to ride a bike, the one I took to his first baseball game, the one I defended at school when he came home crying, the man whose college tuition I paid every single semester with the sweat and calluses of my hands. And there, in front of everyone, he decided to erase my dignity with spit. The silence stretched on, cruel, and in that silence, they all believed I had swallowed it once again. Like so many other times, he had humiliated me. But the truth is, something inside me had shifted. It wasn't just anger. It wasn't just shame. It was something stronger, a decision. I realized in that moment that I had nothing left to lose, that this so-called dead weight he saw in me was actually the very foundation of everything he had, and if he thought he could spit on my story, he would soon find out what it meant to carry the weight of the future alone. I didn't stand up, I didn't shout, I didn't respond. I just sat there, silent, letting them believe I had been defeated. But silence can be more powerful than 1,000 words. And that night, staring at the stain on the floor and the wine glass raised in arrogance, I made a silent promise. He would never hold in his hands what he believed he deserved, and that promise would be kept soon. My name is John Whitaker. I'm 65 years old, and I've spent my whole life working as a carpenter in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm not a man of luxury, never was. My hands carry scars and calluses, living memories of every table, every chair, every door I built. While my friends talked about trips to Europe or brand new cars, I talked about wood, about measurements, about perfect joints. And for me, that was always enough. The workshop I inherited from my father sat at the back of a modest lot, its walls steeped in the smell of sawdust. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. Sunlight slipped through a narrow window and lit up the dust floating in the air, like each particle carried years of effort. In that shop, I built more than furniture. I built the future of my family. It was through that work that I paid for Matthew's college. Every tuition check felt like tearing a piece of myself away. I saved on everything I could: clothes, food, the car. I never bought anything for myself that wasn't absolutely necessary, but for him, I never hesitated. And for a long time, I believed that sacrifice would be recognized, that Matthew, wearing his law degree, dressing in his suits, would remember where he came from, that he'd remember the father who stayed up nights to finish orders, the father who spent Christmas fixing furniture just to afford expensive textbooks. But little by little, I noticed the way he looked at me change. It wasn't pride anymore, it was shame. Matthew was 35 now, an attorney at a prestigious firm, dining at upscale restaurants, befriending people who showed off imported cars and gold watches. And around those people, my son seemed to want to hide me. He said my clothes were too plain, that my manner was clumsy. One day, he even asked me not to attend his award ceremony. He said it would be better for his image if I didn't show up with my hands stained by varnish. It was like a knife in my chest, but I swallowed it. I swallowed it because I believed, deep down, he was still the same boy who used to run through my workshop, curious, asking what I was making, the same boy who laughed when I pushed him gently on the backyard swing. his eyes shining with joy. My wife, Victoria, always tried to comfort me. She said it was just a phase, that Matthew was trying to fit into a tough, competitive world. But I saw something else. I saw arrogance growing in him like a shadow, and that shadow erased me more and more each day. It wasn't only at parties or family conversations. It was in his eyes that said, "You're nothing, and don't think I didn't notice the others." My relatives looked at Matthew with admiration, praising his career, his victories, his comfortable life. And when they looked at me, it was different. Some still respected me quietly, but others let slip that look of pity, as if I were just the old worker who served as the stepping stone for his brilliant son. I smiled, pretended I didn't care, but every one of those looks was another brick on my chest. The truth is, I've always, been proud of who I am. I never needed luxury to know my worth, but being erased by your own blood, that's a pain no words can contain. And it was in that setting, in that contrast between the past I built with sweat and the present where my son spat contempt, that the story of that night unfolded. The dinner table, the wine glasses, the tense stares, none of it appeared out of nowhere. It was the product of years of small wounds, swallowed silences, humiliations disguised as jokes. So when Matthew spat on the floor, in front of everyone, it wasn't just an isolated act. It was the breaking point, the climax of an entire path where he convinced himself he was greater than his roots. I stayed silent that night, but inside me, in the middle of the pain, a certainty was born. Life had given me a single chance to show everyone that there is no shame in being who you are, and I would take that chance, even if it was the last thing I did. My life always fit inside a workshop. The sound of the saw cutting through wood, the perfume of freshly sanded walnut, the steady rhythm of a hammer driving nails. That was the beat of my youth, my adulthood, and my old age. While many took pride in diplomas hanging on their walls, I took pride in furniture built to outlast generations. I started young, still a boy, working beside my father. He taught me that wood wasn't just material. It had a soul. You had to feel the grain, respect its lines, understand where it yielded and where it resisted. A true carpenter doesn't just build furniture, John, he used to say. A true carpenter builds stories that outlive people. I believed him, and I dedicated every year of my life to turning rough planks into pieces that could become part of someone's memories. Dining tables where families laughed and cried, cribs where children dreamed their very first dreams, wardrobes that carried the weight of new clothes, new lives, decades later. But for all the stories I built, few people remembered my name, and ironically, that was exactly what I was proud of. I never needed public recognition. My recognition came the moment I delivered a piece and saw a customer's eyes light up. When a father ran his hand along a crib I'd made and said, "Here my child will sleep in peace." That same simplicity, the thing I valued most, became, for Matthew, a burden. When he was little, he loved being in the shop with me. He'd run between the tools, ask the name of each one, laugh when I made sawdust fly into the air like snow. I remember him sitting on a tall stool, his short legs swinging as he watched me sand a piece of wood. "One day this will be yours, son," I'd tell him, and he'd smile, innocent. But years changed that smile. As a teenager, he no longer wanted to set foot in the shop. He complained about the smell of wood clinging to his clothes. He said his hands got too dirty, that it was embarrassing to go to school smelling like varnish. And when he started dreaming of becoming a lawyer, he treated the workshop like something outdated, like a stain of poverty he needed to erase. I, on the other hand, never saw it as shame. Quite the opposite. The shop was my temple. It was there that I saved enough money to pay for his law degree at Harvard. Yes, Harvard. Every cent came from orders that stole my nights and entire weekends. While he studied in grand libraries, I stayed up until dawn, sawing, gluing, hammering. While he learned the law, I learned how to defeat fatigue so nothing would ever be missing for him. How many times did I go without new clothes because he needed expensive imported books? How many trips did I turn down because I was paying rent in Boston so he could live near campus? How many repairs on my own home did I postpone so he could have the best opportunities? And the cruelest irony, he never knew that in some months I only managed to pay the bills because I sold family heirlooms, an old pocket watch from my father, a few simple pieces of jewelry from my mother. All so Matthew would never lack anything. I'll never forget one moment. It was a brutal winter, and I had an urgent order, a massive oak table for a local bank. The heater broke in the shop, and the cold cut through my bones. Even so, I worked all night, hands numb, body shaking, without stopping. The next morning, I delivered the table. With the payment, I caught up on the overdue tuition bill. I never told Matthew. To him, the money just appeared and due. You know what hurt the most? He never saw it as sacrifice. To him, my work was nothing but a mediocre trade, unworthy of respect. One day, in the middle of an argument, he said, "All you know how to do is build tables. I build the future." Those words burned into me like a branding iron. Just tables? Those tables sustained his life. Those tables paid for his education, his career, his status. Those tables were the foundation of everything he had. But the world doesn't see calluses. The world sees suits. And Matthew chose the world. To him, I was just an old carpenter, incapable of understanding the social codes of his prestigious circles. He never understood that every detail of the comfortable life he enjoyed was nailed into place by my hands. Hands he was ashamed to be seen with in public. Every memory tightened my chest, but alongside the pain, a certainty grew. A man's worth isn't measured by the suit he wears, but by the legacy he leaves. And if Matthew wanted to erase my roots, he would soon learn that the tree you try to cut down may just fall on you. I knew who I was. I knew what I had built, and I was ready to prove it, even if it meant my last fight. That Saturday night seemed, at first, like so many other family gatherings. The dining table was set with care, a white cloth, porcelain plates inherited from my mother, crystal glasses that only came out on special occasions. The smell of roast meat mixed with the wine already flowing between relatives. Voices were loud, laughter echoed, and for a brief moment, I almost believed we were united. But peace, in families like mine, always has an expiration date. Matthew arrived late, as usual. He wore a flawless grey suit, polished shoes that reflected the light, and a gleaming wristwatch that seemed desperate for everyone to notice its price. He walked in with the smile of someone who knows he's the center of attention, and, as always, he was welcomed with disguised applause in the form of comments. "Look who's here, the doctor. That boy's going places." I smiled outwardly. Inside, it stung. I knew every admiring look at him came weighed down with comparison. While they saw in Matthew the picture of modern success, they saw in me nothing but an outdated past. The chatter went on. Glasses filled, plates circulated, but something lingered in the air. I knew my son. I knew when he was about to strike, like a hunter, waiting for the perfect moment to land the blow. And then it came. Matthew raised his glass. The crystal clinked against his knife, commanding everyone's attention. The room went silent. Even the children hushed, as if they sensed something important was about to happen. With a crooked smile, he said, "A toast to the future." He paused, letting the silence stretch, and then he added, "Unlike the heavy past, some insist on dragging around." My heart skipped a beat. I knew exactly who those words were aimed at. There was no disguise. He was staring right at me. A few relatives chuckled awkwardly. Others lowered their eyes. Victoria, my wife, gripped my arm under the table, begging me silently not to react. But Matthew wasn't finished. He wanted the full scene. And that's when he did something I will never forget. He turned slightly, tilted his head, and spat on the floor. A heavy, deliberate spit that landed right beside my chair. The sharp sound hit my ears like a gunshot. The entire room froze. I still held my fork, but my fingers trembled so much that the metal clattered against the plate, echoing like thunder. Blood rushed to my face. My eyes welled up, not from weakness, but from contained fury. No one said a word. No one dared. The silence hung thick, like fog. I remember Aunt Margaret clearing her throat, uneasy. My cousin Alan fidgeting nervously with his napkin. A niece widening her eyes in shock, only to quickly lower her head. And most of all, I remember Matthew's stare. It wasn't just contempt, it was triumph. He wanted to crush me in front of everyone, to prove I was nothing. And in that crooked smile, I saw it clearly. He believed he had won. My chest burned, my breathing grew short. For a second, I thought about standing up, about shouting, about smashing my plate against the floor to return the humiliation. But I didn't, not then. I swallowed hard. I lowered my eyes, and I let everyone believe I had been defeated once again. But inside me, something broke, and when something breaks, it never comes back together the same way. While the others slowly resumed their conversations, pretending nothing had happened, I barely heard them. Their voices faded into distant noise. All that remained in my mind was that dark stain on the floor, the physical symbol of my son's contempt. Victoria squeezed my hand tightly, as if trying to hold back someone about to fall into an abyss. but I had already fallen. And down there, at the bottom of my shame, I found something unexpected: determination. That night, no dish had flavor. No glass had color. Everything was gray. Everything was silence. Except for one thing, the decision forming inside me. I would not scream. I would not retaliate in front of everyone. But the very next day, Matthew would begin to learn that the useless old man still held cards he never imagined existed. He spat on me, and by spitting on me, he spat on the very foundation of his own life. Dinner went on, but nothing was the same. And when everyone left, I stayed behind, sitting at the empty table, staring at that stain on the floor that no cloth could ever erase. It was there, staring at that mark, that I made the promise that would change everything. Matthew's spit wasn't born that night. It was only the final blow in a long chain of wounds I had carried in silence for years. Wounds that seemed small to others, but together they formed a weight that almost crushed me. It started back when he was still in college. I would visit him in Cambridge once a month, bringing toolboxes and small repairs for the apartment he shared with roommates. I remember the first time I showed up with my worn leather jacket, my hands still stained with glue and varnish. He greeted me at the door, but his eyes betrayed his shame. He introduced me quickly, without enthusiasm, as if I were just some handyman called to fix something. I smiled, pretended not to notice, and said nothing. But inside, I felt as if I'd been demoted in front of boys who didn't yet know what it meant to pay a single bill. Then came his internships. At company dinners, I was always the odd one, the father who smelled like wood, while the other fathers were businessmen or doctors. I recall one woman saying, "How interesting, your father still works with his hands." And Matthew, instead of showing pride, rolled his eyes and replied, "Yeah, he's kind of old-fashioned." Polite laughter followed. I just swallowed hard. When he graduated, I thought I would finally hear some recognition. But in his speech, in front of the crowd, he thanked professors, friends, colleagues, and about me, he only said, "My father worked hard so I could get here. But the world is different now." It sounded like gratitude, but it hurt worse than silence, as if I had been nothing more than a stepping stone, disposable, once no longer needed. With time, the distance grew. Matthew began moving in luxurious circles, and whenever I appeared, I became a source of embarrassment. There was a party where he literally asked me not to wear my old wool coat. "Dad, people will notice." I answered only, "So what?" He said nothing, but his eyes said it all. Shame. Even gifts became reasons for scorn. On his 30th birthday, I gave him a car I had restored with my own hands. It was an old Ford, but in excellent condition, engine running perfectly. I handed him the keys with pride, expecting the gratitude of a son who understood the value of effort. But Matthew just looked at it and laughed in front of his friends. "This is junk. I'm not driving trash." The laughter echoed around us. My chest burned. That same day, I drove the car back home, swallowing tears in the silence of the road. And it didn't stop there. Later, he began talking about estate planning. He insisted that I transfer the house and the workshop into his name. "That way you don't have to worry about paperwork, Dad. Leave it to me." But I knew it wasn't about care. It was about impatience. He didn't want to wait for time to do its work. He wanted to erase me while I was still alive. The words hurt too. On one visit, I told him with excitement about a table I was building for a local hotel. He responded with disdain, "Nobody cares about furniture, Dad. What matters is power." I swallowed my anger. But that night, alone in the workshop, I stroked the wood, as if apologizing to an old friend. The breaking point came at a smaller dinner, just weeks before the fateful night. I shared a simple childhood memory of him, about how he used to be fascinated watching sawdust fall like snow. People smiled, some even laughed, and he, with a dry voice, said, "I don't know how I ever tolerated that dusty place for so long." The laughter shifted, some embarrassed, others complicit, and I stood there, swallowing yet another knife. Every detail, every gesture, every joke, all those marks piled inside me like stones in the pockets of a drowning man. I smiled. I stayed quiet. I pretended it didn't matter. But the truth was, each memory hollowed me out from within. And then came that night. The toast, the spit, that public gesture that concentrated in one instant years of contempt. I could have exploded right then, but I didn't. Silence became my refuge, because I knew my answer wouldn't come in words. It would come in actions. Actions no one could ever erase. That night, after everyone left, the house felt bigger. The silence echoed through the rooms as if mocking me. The wine glasses were still on the table, some with dregs left, reminding me of the scene I'd give anything to forget. The white tablecloth was stained with sauce, and on the floor, there was still a dark trace. The the mark of Matthew's spit. I walked past slowly, my eyes locked on that stain, and felt my heart pound heavy. I walked into the office. It was a small room, its walls lined with old books, heavy with the smell of paper and aged wood. In the corner stood the iron safe I had inherited from my father, a heavy, cold safe that carried more than material value. It carried the history of my family. I opened the desk drawer and took out the key. For a few seconds, I just stared at it. A small key, but weighted with destiny. I turned the lock. The creak of metal tore through the silence of the house like a scream. When the door opened, I saw everything that remained from a lifetime of work. Property deeds, carefully saved earnings, investments I had never flaunted, the deed to my workshop, documents that guaranteed that nothing I had built would ever be lost. I ran my fingers across each paper. I didn't feel pride, like I once did. I felt anger, a cold, controlled anger that whispered, "The time has come." In that moment, I realized what lay inside that safe wasn't just money or property. It was my sweat crystallized on paper. It was living proof that the so-called dead weight carried far more than my arrogant son could ever imagine. I sat down in the chair, the key still in my hand, staring at the stacks of documents. Each contract, each deed, each receipt carried a piece of me. I thought of the sleepless nights in the shop, the numb hands in winter, the watch I had sold from my father to pay a semester at Harvard. All of it was there, kept in silence. And now, that silence would be my weapon. The next morning, I sought out Charles Donovan, a trusted lawyer, an old friend who knew every detail of my life. He welcomed me into his office lined with law books, a room where the smell of leather sofas mingled with the strong aroma of fresh coffee. I placed the folder on his desk. Charles opened it, adjusted his glasses, and began flipping through the pages. His eyes narrowed with each document. "John, do you know what you're about to do?" he asked in a deep, grave voice. I looked straight at him. "I know. I'm tired of being treated like a burden. It's time to prove I still have a voice." Charles exhaled, closed the folder, and placed his hands firmly on top of it. "Then let's lock everything down. Not a single loophole left." We spent hours reviewing every detail. Joint accounts were separated. Deeds were reassessed. Investments redistributed into a trust Matthew could never touch. It was like building an invisible fortress around everything I had earned. And while Charles spoke of clauses and procedures, my mind drifted back to the dinner table. The spit, the smirk, the embarrassed stares of relatives, and those memories fueled me. I wasn't just protecting my assets, I was protecting my dignity. At the end, Charles shut the folder with a dry snap. "It's done. He won't have access. Not now. Not ever." I nodded in silence. This wasn't blind revenge. It was justice. It was giving back the weight of my calloused hands to the one who dared to call them useless. I returned home by dusk. The sun was setting behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I sat alone on the porch, the folder by my side. The cold wind wrapped around me, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel just pain. I felt strength. I felt that finally, I had stopped being a spectator to my own humiliation. Victoria appeared at the door, her eyes tired but searching. "What did you do today?" she asked, as if she already knew the answer. I looked at her and replied calmly, "I protected what's ours." She said nothing. She only nodded. There were tears in her eyes, but behind them something else, relief. That night, I closed the safe again. The metallic click echoed through the house. This time, not as a reminder of secrets kept, but as the signal of something greater. It was the sound of a new chapter, a turning point that began in silence, but would soon echo before everyone. Matthew thought spitting on me would be the end of the story. He had no idea that, in that very gesture, he gave me the fire I needed to write the next chapter. And this chapter would not be written with words, but with actions no one could erase. 2 days after that dinner, the family gathered again. It was a Sunday afternoon at my older brother Richard's house. He had called everyone to settle some pending family matters, but I knew Matthew had orchestrated the occasion. In truth, the gathering was nothing but a stage for my son to parade his success, and perhaps corner me once again into giving him what was not his. I arrived early. The autumn sun streamed through the wide windows of the living room, casting golden beams across polished furniture. The central table was already covered in documents, as if an improvised courtroom had been set. Around it, chairs in a circle held uncles, cousins, nieces, all with curious, expectant faces, almost thrilled at the prospect of a confrontation. Matthew entered minutes later, a dark suit, a leather briefcase in hand, and that rehearsed air of superiority. He greeted some curtly, flashed a confident smile, and sat at the head of the table, as if the seat were his by right. He looked at me briefly, his gaze dripping with condescension, and said with mock concern, "Dad, let's settle this quickly. That way everyone can rest easy." The room went silent. Even the children playing in the hallway stopped to peek in. Victoria sat beside me. She gripped my hand, but this time her touch didn't feel like fear. It felt like strength. Matthew opened his briefcase, spread some papers across the table, and continued. "We need to think about the future. This is the best time to organize the inheritance. Transfer the house, the workshop, avoid bureaucracy. I just want to make things easier." Some relatives nodded. Others turned their eyes to me, waiting. I knew what they expected, that I would agree, that I would bow once again, that I would accept being treated as dispensable. But not this time. This time would be different. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small object. I placed it on the table. It was the key to the safe. The metal glinted under the fading light, and in that instant, every gaze fell upon it. I looked straight into Matthew's eyes and said, calm but firm as iron, "You spat on the floor of my house. Today, I lock away what you will never hold in your hands." The air seemed to vanish from the room. A murmur rippled among the relatives. Victoria's eyes widened, but she said nothing. Richard coughed nervously. A niece covered her mouth with her hand. Matthew blinked, caught off guard, but quickly tried to regain control. "Dad, you can't just… This isn't rational. You have to understand that." I raised my hand, cutting him off. "I don't have to understand anything. I built all of this with these hands. I paid for every cent of your education, every cent of your life, and in return you call me deadweight and spit on me. Well, hear me now. From this moment on, you will never touch a single thing that's mine." My voice echoed. It was as if the very walls of the room repeated it. I felt the weight of every stare, but for the first time in a long while I didn't shrink. On the contrary, I rose to my feet. Matthew's face turned red. His hand clenched the papers on the table as if he wanted to rip them apart. "This isn't fair," he shouted. I smirked. Fair? Fair would have been you respecting me. But since that never happened, I had to bring justice my own way. The words didn't come out as screams. They came out as verdicts. Each sentence, a hammer blow, sealing his fate. Matthew tried to laugh nervously, glancing around the room as if searching for support. "Are you all hearing this? He thinks he can cut me out. I'm the natural heir." But no one laughed. No one answered. Faces were serious, motionless. Some even carried a spark of quiet approval. I knew it. In that moment, the balance had shifted. The man who had always been seen as a shadow was now standing tall, and the arrogant son was unmasked by his own hunger for power. I picked up the key from the table and slid it back into my pocket. "This safe is locked, Matthew, and it will stay that way until my last day. And if one day you want something from me, it won't be with papers or spit. It'll be with respect." The silence that followed was absolute, but it wasn't the same silence of humiliation. It was heavy, the silence of impact, of transformation, a silence in which everyone understood something had changed forever. Matthew slowly sat back down, his face flushed, his breathing ragged. He looked at me like one looks at an unexpected enemy, and for the first time, I saw in his eyes not contempt, but fear. The room seemed frozen in time. No one took a deep breath. No one dared to move a muscle. The key was no longer on the table, but its image lingered in everyone's minds, like an invisible crown over me. Matthew, seated again at the head of the table, tapped his fingers nervously against the wood, a habit he couldn't hide. The silence didn't last long. "You can't do this to me." His voice cracked, dripping with rage and disbelief. His eyes burned, his face flushed, exposing his fury. He looked like a spoiled child, unable to accept that the natural order of things had been broken. I raised my eyes. Steady, I already did. Those 3 words fell like stones. Richard, my brother, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. An aunt looked toward Victoria, searching for comfort, and my wife, silent, just stared at me with tears she refused to let fall. Matthew stood up abruptly, knocking his chair to the floor. The sharp crash echoed through the room. He pointed his finger at me. "You're destroying what we built together." I gave a bitter half-smile. "Together?" I spent sleepless nights, worked until dawn in that workshop, even sold my father's watch to pay for your college. together. You never shed a drop of sweat to earn what you have. What you call your accomplishments were built by my hands. He stepped toward me, eyes blazing with hatred. You're just an old carpenter. Without me, without my name, no one would even remember you. That's when the climax came. I stood up slowly. The floor creaked under my steps, as if the house itself knew it was witnessing something decisive. I stopped face to face with my son, close enough to smell his expensive cologne mixed with the hot breath of anger. I looked straight into his eyes and said, my voice low but firm as steel, you spit on everything I built, but you'll never have the courage to build something from nothing. Remember this, Matthew. The dead weight you mock is the very weight that carried your life until today. The words cut through the air like a blade. For a second his face twisted. He wanted to respond, but there was no answer left. It was as if the mask had finally fallen in front of everyone. A murmur rippled through the room. Some relatives lowered their heads, ashamed for never defending me. Others looked at me with newfound respect, perhaps even regret. Matthew still tried to retort, you'll regret this. You'll end up alone. I shook my head calmly. Alone? I've been alone plenty of times, Matthew, but I was never empty. The emptiness is in you, and that safe you crave so much isn't a prison. It's a symbol, a reminder that respect can't be bought, can't be forced, can't be inherited. Respect is earned. My voice carried strength, even without shouting. It was the certainty that sustained me. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't speaking just to him. I was speaking to everyone, to every gaze that, for years, had treated me like dead weight. Matthew shrank back. He still wore the mask of anger, but I saw something new in his eyes. Fear. Fear of realizing that, for the first time, power was no longer in his hands. The chair lying behind him was the perfect symbol. The heir in his expensive suit, his shiny watch, now stood exposed, unsupported, before the father he had always underestimated. The tension reached its peak, and, like in a movie, everything resolved in a single moment, in a single phrase. Yao drew a deep breath, lifted my head and declared, I can lose everything, but I will never lose myself again. And you just lost the right to inherit what you spat on. Silence. Dense. Irreversible. No one moved. No one dared to challenge it. That was the verdict, and everyone knew it. Matthew took a step back. His eyes, once full of arrogance, were now hollow, and without another word, he walked out of the room, leaving behind the fallen chair and a silence heavy as lead. And I stood there, breathing deep, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one humiliated. He was. And that short, sharp, definitive phrase would echo in his memory forever. After Matthew slammed the door behind him, the room remained in absolute silence. But it wasn't the silence that had suffocated me in past humiliations. This silence was different. It was the silence of impact, of transformation. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something that would change the family dynamic forever. The chair lying on the floor behind him stood like a monument to his defeat. For a few seconds, no one moved, until Victoria, eyes brimming with tears, placed her hand over mine and whispered, You finally said what needed to be said. My brother Richard cleared his throat, uneasy. He had always been one to avoid conflict, but even he couldn't hide the admiration shining in his eyes. John, it was harsh, but it was necessary. Some cousins exchanged glances. I could see a mix of surprise and respect in them. For years they had watched me stay silent, swallow insults, accept veiled jokes. That afternoon, the roles reversed. I was no longer the invisible man in the family. I was the center. I was living proof that dignity does not age. The news spread quickly. The next day, whispers were already circling through group chats, phone calls rippling across the entire family. Some criticized me, saying I had disinherited my own son. Others, quietly, congratulated me for having the courage to draw the line. I listened to it all, but nothing shook me, because inside I carried a new kind of peace, the peace of a man who had finally stopped being a hostage to ingratitude. Of course, Matthew didn't take it quietly. 2 days later, he tried to reach me. He called, sent messages, left notes through acquaintances, but I didn't answer until one of his lawyers contacted me, asking for a meeting. The intention was clear: to challenge my decisions, find a loophole, force me to give in. I sat once again across from Charles Donovan, my attorney. He flipped through the letters and gave a half smile. They've got nothing, John. You locked everything down at the right time. They can kick and scream all they want, but they won't get a cent without your say-so. I nodded silently. There was no joy in it, but there was justice. For the first time, Matthew would have to feel the weight of responsibility he had always avoided. He had spat on me. Now he would have to walk without the ground he thought was guaranteed. And that's exactly what happened. With no access to my assets, He had to face life with his own two hands. He learned that bills don't get paid with arrogance, that clients don't appear just because of a last name, and that fair-weather friends vanish the moment the shine of wealth fades. A few weeks later, I heard he was already struggling. Late rent, the luxury car up for sale, fewer invitations to dinners. From a distance I watched, not with pleasure, but with the calm of someone who knows life has its way of collecting debts. Meanwhile, within the family, something else changed. The same people who once looked away when Matthew humiliated me now faced me directly. Some came to me and said, "You were right, John." Others, without words, just shook my hand firmly. I didn't need apologies, but I'll admit that late recognition brought me a quiet relief. Victoria changed the most. For years she carried the pain with me, always trying to shield me from our son. But after that confrontation, I saw her walk through the house differently, straighter, prouder, as if she too had finally been freed from a burden. And me, I felt light. The safe was locked, secured. But more than that, so was my heart. No longer vulnerable to contempt, no longer open to the wounds of silence. Matthew tried to approach me again a few times, never with humility, always with demands, accusations, emotional blackmail. And every time, he got the same answer: closed doors. Until little by little, he went quiet. Not from remorse, but because he finally realized he had no power over me anymore. The months that followed were different. I returned to the workshop every day, even retired. I'd sit in front of an old oak table, run my hand across the surface, and breathe in the smell of wood. It was as if every fiber whispered to me, "You endured." The consequences weren't just material, they were emotional, symbolic. For a long time I believed silence made me small, but I discovered that silence, when used well, can become a weapon, and the responsibility Matthew so desperately avoided had finally caught up with him. His fall was harsh, but no harsher than the fall of respect he chose the night he spat on me. And that was the true reckoning, not the loss of wealth, but the loss of honor in front of his own family. Today, sitting on the porch of the house I built with my own hands, I feel the cold autumn wind brush against my face and realize that despite everything, I don't carry bitterness anymore. I carry only the certainty that dignity, once reclaimed, weighs more than any fortune. The safe remains locked. It sits in the office, its cold metal guarding not just documents and assets, but memories. Each deed, each receipt, each contract is a reminder of how hard I fought. And more than that, it is an invisible fortress against contempt, not because I fear losing what I have, but because I learned that no ungrateful son can ever turn a lifetime of sweat into bargaining chips. Sometimes, I still hear stories about Matthew. They say he sold the luxury car, cut back his expenses, lost his shine in social circles. Others whisper he became more reclusive, less showy. I don't go looking for news. I take no joy in his downfall. The truth is, everyone reaps what they sow, and he harvested the bitter fruit of arrogance. There were nights I wondered if I went too far, if at some point I should have given in, let go, forgiven too quickly. But then I remember that night of the spit, the look of disdain, the sensation of being erased in front of everyone. And I know, no, it wasn't too far. It was necessary. If I had stayed silent one more time, I would have signed my own sentence of invisibility, and there was no greater price to pay than that. Victoria now walks through the house with a lighter step. She had always carried the silent wounds with me, the pains I pretended not to feel. Now, I see in her eyes the calm of someone who can finally breathe without fear of the next dinner ending in humiliation. Our days have gone back to being simple, as they always were. And that simplicity, the very thing Matthew despised, is what sustains our peace. My neighbors still greet me the same way, but I notice a different kind of respect. Some of them have heard the story, because stories like this spread, and in their eyes, I see an admiration I never had before. The respect for someone who didn't bow. It isn't about money. It isn't about the safe. It's about choosing to stand firm when everyone expected me to stay weak. Sometimes I still walk into the workshop, even retired. The old tools are still there, the smell of wood soaked into the walls. I run my hand over the surface of an unfinished table and smile. It's as if every mark, every scratch, every dent reminds me that I was never a burden. I was the foundation, and foundations don't show up in the picture of the facade, but without them, no house stands. Maybe Matthew still hasn't understood that. Maybe one day he will, maybe never. That I can't control. What I can control is what remains in me, and what remains is strength. The strength of knowing my life isn't defined by anyone's contempt, not even my own son's. Today, when I look back, I see that the turning point wasn't just against him. It was against every gaze that had ever diminished me, against every pitying smile, every silence that treated me as invisible, against the false belief that being simple means being small. No, being simple means carrying what's essential without getting lost in illusions. If Matthew ever knocks on my door again, I don't know what I'll do. Maybe I'll listen. Maybe I won't. But I know this. I will never let myself be erased again, because those who have tasted the bitter sting of betrayal learn to savor even more the sweetness of dignity. And that is what I leave recorded here, in this story. It's not about money. It's not about inheritance. It's about respect. It's about remembering that the worth of a man is not measured by what he accumulates, but by what he builds with his own hands. And I built far more than furniture. I built a legacy. I built proof that even a father silenced for years can raise his voice at the right moment and change everything. Now I want to hear from you. Have they ever tried to silence your voice inside your own home? Have they ever made you feel invisible, as if your whole life had no worth? Share it here in the comments. Your story matters, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because every comment, every subscription, every voice that joins us here proves one thing: no one can steal what is most sacred, the right to be respected. And when you click subscribe, you're not just signing up to hear more stories like mine. You're sending a message to the world. Dignity is not begged for. Dignity is earned. As the cold wind rustles the leaves in the yard and the safe key rests in my pocket, I close my eyes and take a deep breath. I don't feel hatred. I don't feel bitterness. I feel only peace. The peace of someone who, after so much silence, finally spoke and was heard.